Okay, can I please just call us all to order? I have one apology, which comes from Stephen Bush, who is the political editor of the New Statesman, who was literally on his way here tonight when it was confirmed that Labour will apparently be moving towards, in some slightly indefinite, vague way, which you may find out if you go onto your phone, but not when you're listening to our speakers, moving towards backing a people's vote. So he has to go and cover that. Okay, yeah, a few tepid rounds of applause there. We shall see. So Stephen sends his apologies, but as I say, genuinely on his way here, had to turn around because he has to report that possibly very important news. Nevertheless, I hope anyway that you will find the speakers that we have tonight just as gripping as you would find the chair. I'm going to step into Stephen's shoes and introduce you to our speakers. Before I do that, I want to read you out a tweet from the estimable Robert Harris. Some of you may have seen it today. He tweeted, I think it was around 2 o'clock today. This is the author and, of course, formerly a political correspondent. He said, living in the UK now is a bit like being a passenger on an aircraft, noticing the flight attendants banging on the cockpit door, but not being admitted, while through the windows the ground seems suddenly closer. I think that probably sums up the feeling that many of us have at the moment. But we're not here exclusively to talk about Brexit tonight, but to talk about the implications of the decision that we made on Brexit back in 2016 for the future of British politics, and in particular to talk about the role of direct democracy in the UK and whether after that Brexit referendum it has a future in its current form or maybe in some other form. We have an excellent panel here today at the Ireland Institute. First of all, we'll kick off with our own Robert Saunders, who is a senior lecturer in the School of History here, and of course the editor of a book which you will be able to buy downstairs if you haven't already read it, Yes to Europe, the 1975 Referendum. Rob will be talking a little bit about that, but talking about the lessons of 1975 and about how we might apply those in the future. Then we're going to hear from Sarah Hobholt, who is Sutherland Chair in European Institutions at the London School of Economics. Her books include Blaming Europe, Responsibility Without Accountability in the EU, and she is an expert on referendums throughout the continent. Sarah is going to focus chiefly on recent research on public opinion and how identities in this country have polarised around Leave and Remain since the referendum. And I would commend to you, if you haven't already listened to it on BBC Radio iPlayer, or now I should say BBC Sounds, an excellent little analysis programme by James Tilley on conspiracy theories, in which Sarah had something I think very interesting to say about the development of the kind of us and them identities that people take on. After Sarah, we're going to hear from Meg Russell of UCL's Constitution Unit. She's Professor of British and Comparative Politics there and the Director of that unit. She is an expert on legislation at Westminster. She's published a book on that and, of course, on the House of Lords. And, of course, she has been very active in the Constitution Unit's own attempt to help us understand direct democracy, the referendum on Brexit more generally. And we are expecting Meg to talk about the constitutional implications and the implications for the relationship with Parliament of the referendum, and referendums in general. And then finally, the person who's come furthest to talk to you tonight, we have David Farrell, who is Chair of Politics at University College Dublin. For years actually worked at Manchester University in the UK before he was eventually tempted back home to Ireland. David is one of those perhaps all too rare people in political science who is very actively involved in some ways in the governance of his own country. He was the research director of the Constitutional Convention in Ireland and the research leader of the Irish Citizens Assembly. And David will be speaking particularly about the Irish experience of referendums, but also how referendums in some ways can be done differently and perhaps done better, some would say, than we managed to do in 2016. So we've got a whole raft of expertise. You should, we hope, be able to get onto the web via the password there. We omitted, unfortunately, the crucial hashtag. So just we've come up with one which is not particularly inventive, but it's MEI Brexit Ref. Okay, so MEI Brexit Ref is the hashtag if you're interested in using hashtags. So without more ado, I should have said who I am. I'm Tom Bale. I am Professor of Politics here and also now Director of the Mile End Institute. So it's our pleasure to host, first of all, Rob Saunders. Thank you. Rob.
Well, thank you very much and thank you for coming. I think there's only one place that an evening like this can start, and that is with the collective nervous breakdown that has been engulfing British politics ever since 2016. And if we've learned anything over the last 2.5 years, it is the extraordinary power of a referendum. Referendums can shatter governments and they can destroy the careers of successful politicians. In 2015, David Cameron was the most successful Conservative for a quarter of a century. In 2016, he was sitting in a shepherd's hut in the Cotswolds trying to think of a title for his memoirs. Referendums can dissolve party loyalties. They can create new and exciting alignments of opinion. And since 2016, I think our politics has failed spectacularly to handle the fallout of that referendum in a way that has deepened political divisions and has left both Leavers and Remainers feeling angry and discontented. So it's perhaps tempting to conclude from all of this that referendums are just a really bad idea. And that, for a long time, was the common sense of British politics. In 1945, Winston Churchill proposed what could have been Britain's first referendum. He suggested a referendum on extending the life of Parliament and extending the wartime coalition. And he received what was really a flamethrower of a reply from the Labour leader Clement Attlee, who declared that the referendum was alien to our traditions, an instrument of Nazism and fascism, and could not possibly be endeared to the British heart. What I want to suggest this evening, though, is that the problems that we've had since 2016 are not intrinsic to the referendum. And they're certainly not the fault of the electorate. The problem here is not that voters can't be trusted with difficult policy questions. The problem, I think, is that we haven't thought hard enough in Britain about how we use referendums, when we use them, and why. And we certainly haven't thought about how we connect together the different elements of our democracy, the tools of a direct democracy, like the referendum, and our representative democracy in Parliament. And unless we do that, I think we're going to face all of these problems again in the future. Because whether we like it or not, whether we're on Attlee's side of the question or somebody else's, the referendum is now a part of how we in Britain are governed. So to get the ball rolling and thinking about how we might do this better in future, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the referendum came into British politics in the first place. So how did this alien device burst out of the stomach of the British Constitution? And what might we learn from that? So let's start with a little bit of background.
Down a bit in...
Sorry?
Can we have the lights down a bit?
Is that going to be okay for the filming?
Could be.
Sorry. You're happy with that? Let's experiment. Right, let's try AV1.
Plunged into darkness now.
Is that all right?
Is that Gary? Is that
Great.
It's okay.
Okay, thank you. Now, the idea of a referendum had been bubbling away in British politics right the way through the 19th century, but it really came into the mainstream of British political debate in the years before 1914. And it did so in a context that was not too dissimilar to the present day. So this was a time of tremendous political volatility, and it's a time when Parliament was grappling with really fundamental questions, questions that spectacularly divided opinion and that didn't really fit neatly along party lines. So questions like votes for women, tariff reform, an issue that has quite a lot of similarities with Brexit. Most importantly, the question of home rule for Ireland. Should Ireland have its own parliament? It's also a time when new parties were emerging to challenge the old establishment, most famously and most successfully, the rise of the Labour Party. Now, at this point in time, it was the right of British politics that became most attracted to the referendum. So this figure here is Albert Venn Dicey. Dicey was the author of The Introduction to the Study of the Law of the Constitution, a tremendously influential text, and he was the most influential and the most important constitutional theorist of his day. He's a kind of Edwardian Meg Russell. And Dicey thought that one of the great dangers of the British Constitution was that it had very few barriers to revolutionary change. So in most countries, if you want to carry out a change on the scale of Brexit or on the scale of votes for women, you would have to go through some special constitutional procedures to get there. And that's designed to make those kind of changes difficult. In Britain, historically, that wasn't the case. You can pass a withdrawal agreement or you can create a parliament for Ireland in exactly the same way as you would pass any other legislation. So the concern for someone like Dicey was that this made radical constitutional change dangerously easy, and it gave a lot of power to temporary majorities in the House of Commons. So Dicey argued that once a bill like this had gone through the House, once it had completed all of its parliamentary stages, it should then be put to the electorate in a referendum. And he called this a people's veto. It's what we might call a final say. So this is the referendum as a check on Parliament, a way of making sure that a change that has a majority in Parliament also has the consent of the electorate. So this is essentially a conservative with a small c version of the referendum. It is about making change harder. And partly because of that, the left tended to be quite suspicious of the referendum. They saw it as an obstacle to reforming governments. So Roy Jenkins in the 1970s wrote to Harold Wilson that the referendum was a more powerful weapon against progressive legislation than anything we have known in this country since the curbing of the House of Lords. And he warned that things like decriminalising homosexuality, race relations legislation, the abolition of capital punishment, all of those things might have been stopped if they had had to face a referendum. And yet, from the late 1960s, support does start to gather force on the left of British politics. And its main champion is this man, Tony Benn. So over the 60s and 70s, Benn became increasingly suspicious of Parliament. He came to view Parliament increasingly as a kind of establishment club. It was something that gave people the illusion that they were self-governed, when what it actually did was work to shut out radical politics and radical legislation. So for Benn, the point of the referendum was a way of overriding the establishment, of going over the heads of Parliament and opening up the legislative process to more radical forces outside. So we talked about the referendum creating a new popular democracy in place of parliamentary democracy as we know it. And Benn had a dream. He dreamed of a day when every household in the country would have an electronic button that people could use to intervene directly in the great decisions of their time. And his legacy, of course, lives on in shows like Strictly Come Dancing and The X Factor. So this is a radical vision of the referendum, but that too had its critics. And Ben's opponents identified three key arguments against this model. So the first was that it would promote irresponsible governments. It would allow people to campaign for things and to make promises in a campaign that they would never actually have to fulfil. It would allow governments to pass measures that they didn't believe in while blaming the electorate. Where have we seen that? Secondly, they argued that it would reduce complex political questions to a simple yes-no decision. So you could vote in a referendum to cut immigration, and you wouldn't have to say who you were planning to shut out and how. You could vote to cut taxes, and you wouldn't have to make a decision about spending. And then the third argument is that it might promote authoritarianism. Because whereas the parliamentary system institutionalises opposition, we have a leader of the opposition who is a salaried person. The fear was that under a referendum, those who continue to oppose its verdict would be seen as enemies of the people, resisting the democratic will. So what we've got here are two radically different models of the referendum. Dicey was trying to make change harder, Ben was trying to make change easier. And they work in different ways. So Dicey's model comes at the end of the legislative process. Ben's model might come at the start. It might be an instruction to Parliament. Now, when Britain finally had its first referendum in 1975, it didn't really follow either of those models. It happened because the governing party, which at this time was the Labour Party, was so hopelessly divided on Europe that it was threatening to fall apart on the issue. So the idea of this was that you could take this issue out of party politics, you could hand it over to the electorate, and that would allow party politics to continue as normal. So this is a third model of the referendum, which I've sometimes referred to as the bomb disposal referendum. It's the idea that you take a kind of fizzing explosive force out of party politics and you hand it over to the public. And of course, that's also the model that we saw in 2016, where we have an issue that was tearing the Conservative Party apart, and the idea was you lift it out and hand it over to someone else. Now, that sort of worked in 1975, though it didn't stop the rise of the SDP. But to the extent that it worked, it was because that referendum was a vote to continue the status quo. So the instruction in 1975 was to carry on being a member of the European community. In 2016, of course, the electorate rejected the status quo, and the instruction was to do something radically new. So instead of diffusing a dangerous political issue, it turbocharged it and made it the biggest issue in British politics. So 2016 was clearly a long way from the Dicey model, where Parliament draws up a specific proposal and puts it to the public. But it wasn't exactly the Benite model either, because what Tony Benn had imagined was that there would be a continuing conversation between Parliament and the electorate. Benn wanted the referendum to be a routine part of British constitutional practice. Whereas, although the picture seems to be changing tonight, the general message from both party leadership since 2016 has been that the conversation stopped on the 23rd of June. That having another referendum would undermine democracy, in Barry Gardner's words, or it would be a gross betrayal of democracy in Theresa May's. So in that sense, what we're left with is an instruction which has as close as you're ever going to get in a democracy to the force of a holy instruction. But we've got a whole tribe of rival oracles telling us what they think it means. So they might think that respecting the referendum result means no deal, or they might think it means Theresa May's deal, or they might think it means Jeremy Corbyn's package, or simply that there is no deal that fits what people were voting for. Now, to reiterate, that's not the fault of the electorate. They weren't asked what kind of Brexit they wanted. It's about the slipshod and the careless way that we have used the referendum. So how do we get out of this? Well, firstly, I think we need to agree some rules on when we use referendums, so that we don't just do this when parties think it suits them. And I hope that's something that we can discuss this evening. And secondly, if we are going to use the referendum as an instruction, we need to think about how we frame the question so that we know what that instruction means. And we might want to think about what kind of other tools, like Citizens Assemblies, we might use to help with that. And then thirdly and finally, I'd suggest that we might want to revisit the Dyson model of a people's veto, in which we check whether the Brexit that's being hammered out in Parliament is in fact what the public actually want to do. I'll suggest that would not be a betrayal of democracy, but a return to an older model of what the referendum was actually for. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So let me continue in a sense on the note that Robert started with, which is the sort of the power of the referendum in changing the political landscape and changing things that even go beyond politics. And let me start with just an anecdote for this evening, where I struggled a bit to get here because they closed Holborn Station due to overcrowding, and I took a cab, and the cab driver asked me, "Oh, so why are you going, this way?" And I said, "Oh, I'm participating in a Brexit debate." And he said, "Well, I'm a Leaver." And I thought that was very telling. He didn't say I voted Leave in 2016. He said that he was a Leaver, which means something else than just voting something. It means that he somehow identifies with this political position. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about, because that's something that has very much characterized politics since 2016. These are two different front pages from the Mirror, because of course none of us knew exactly, some people claim to know, but none of us really knew what the outcome was going to be. And of course there was the project Reunite. Now we all have to get back together, and that's the project We Are, where there's not so much getting back together. We all know now how it ended, but there hasn't been very little sort of getting back together. So where we are now is really in this world where the vote choices we all made in 2016 very much still defines, and perhaps even more so than back then, defines how we look at politics, how we look at the decision to vote, but also how we look at the future of Brexit. And perhaps even more importantly, also how we look at each other. So that's some of the research I've been doing, and actually the sort of the motivation behind that was looking at social media and the kind of quite a lot of abuse that people give each other on both sides, and thinking, wow, this goes beyond just sort of disagreeing on politics. People really feel a great deal of animosity towards people on the other side. And of course, political debate and disagreement is a good thing, but as Lipset says in this quote, when these things solidify to the point where people cannot see the other side's point of view, it can also be dangerous to democracy. Now, I'm not saying that this is where we are, but certainly the referendum has contributed to a new fault line, a new division in British politics. And I use this term affected polarization, which actually is a sort of import from US politics. Those of you, and I'm sure that's most of you who follow American politics, will know that Democrats and Republicans don't exactly see eye to eye, and that Trump has very much been part of exacerbating that. So it's not just referendums that can cause these kind of partisan divisions, but what's very fascinating about the Brexit referendum is, in a sense, this has emerged out of from a starting point where people really didn't feel particularly strongly about the European Union. Most people were not sort of waking up every day and thinking, God, this EU is just marvelous, or this EU is just the worst thing that's ever happened. It is not, if we look at survey data and if we look at electoral behavior over the past decade, that was not the thing really driving most voters in Britain. However, of course, there was politicians, and I don't need to sort of name any names, who would wake up every morning and think a lot about the EU, and that's, of course, part of the reason we are where we are today. So I look at, in our research, which is done together with James Tilley, who was mentioned by Tim, and Thomas Lieper, we looked at these sort of 3 signs of effective polarization. So this is this idea that we feel an identification with our in-group, the people we share an opinion with, but we also feel animosity towards the out-group. And the 3 signs are, first of all, this subjective identification, that people are willing to say they're Remainers or they're Brexiteers. And the prejudice and animosity is that they have quite negative views of people who hold a different view. And then finally, what we know from these sort of social identities is that they also create a very biased view of the world. And we see all of these things when it comes to Brexit. First of all, the British election study used to ask people in the aftermath of the referendum, so do you feel close to other people who are Leavers and Remainers? And then when we started this project, we started to ask this sort of more conventional question of whether or not you identify, whether or not you see yourself as a Leaver or Remainer. And what we find is that between between 75 and 80% of people do identify when we ask these kind of questions as a Leaver or Remainer. It's higher than partisan identities, so it's higher when we ask the equivalent questions about whether you see yourself as Labour or Conservative or Liberal Democrats and so on. And also when we ask follow-up questions, it is more strongly held at this point in time in British politics. Now, it also has led to what I call outgroup prejudice. So we don't necessarily like people sort of in the abstract who are on the other side of the argument. So we ask people, do you think the following terms describe Leavers and Remainers? And this is kind of standard questions that are used, for example, in terms of trying to look at racial prejudice and so on. So among Leavers, they would look at other Leavers as honest, intelligent, and open-minded, and they would look at Remainers as more hypocritical, selfish, and close-minded. And we can see it's exactly the opposite when it comes to Remainers. In fact, if anything, we find that Remainers are a little bit more prejudiced towards Leavers, maybe not surprisingly because they're on the losing side, Remainers. So that always makes you a little bit more angry. And also, it really affects how people look at the world, the economy. I did this piece of research where we look at what are people's perception of the economy. And we find that in the run-up to the referendum vote, actually Leavers and Remainers, the people who ended up voting Leave and Remain, looked at the economy in a very similar way. But overnight, when the referendum happened, Remainers became very pessimistic. And they've remained very pessimistic. But Leavers have remained very optimistic. And we do this open-ended research where we ask thousands and thousands of people every month, what do you think are going to be the consequences of Brexit? And there's one camp that says this is going to be terrible. It's going to be terrible mainly for the economy. It's sort of self-inflicted damage. We're going to lose jobs. The pound is going to fall, so on. And there's another camp that says this is going to be great. We're going to make trade deal. We're going to be more prosperous. We're going to be independent, and so on. So there's really these two very different worldviews. And here it's just in terms of Leavers and Remainers really divide in terms of how optimistic or pessimistic they are. And we also conducted experiments. Tim mentioned that actually in this program, on this Radio 4 analysis program, I talked about that, where we thought, well, that's maybe just because we talk about Brexit identities. What if we just give people a hypothetical example where they are asked to choose between different candidates for BBC Director General or a lodger for their house? So we give them sort of CVs. And the Brexit stance is just one information amongst many, including also their partisanship, their education, their age, their experience, and so on. And Brexit by far came out as the key factor. And these are not in surveys that were otherwise political. So it does suggest that this is something people feel strongly about at the moment. So just to speculate a bit on why is it that Brexit has been so polarizing, because David will talk to us later about the Irish referendums, and you can have referendums that don't lead to very deep divisions in society. So why is it Brexit has been particularly polarizing? I mean, of course, it was a very significant issue. That's one thing. When you have big constitutional issues like this, it was a very divisive debate. We heard from Robert about the sort of binary nature of the referendum. But also, of course, it was the outcome. It was the outcome that was a shift away from status quo. But I think more so than that, the government and the political system has also handled it extremely badly. So from the beginning, the position was one of let's try and find out what Leavers wanted, and not the position of let's try and find a compromise for the nation. There was no attempt to agree a cross-party solution. And I think a parallel on how this could have been done very differently is what happened in Denmark in '92. I'm originally from Denmark, and I remember this very clearly because this was a shock to the Danish system and the European political system when the Danes voted to reject the Maastricht Treaty. It was really, people were shell-shocked, and this had been a very intense, divisive campaign, and all of a sudden the Danish people had turned against the political, the economic establishment. And what did Parliament do in response? Government didn't say, okay, we're going to just sort of implement this sort of for the 51%, what they said is, okay, let's find a cross-party parliamentary solution. So they took all major parties together on either side, and they came together on a national compromise that tried to look at what are the main concerns. They agreed 4 opt-outs of the treaties, including the opt-out of the euro, which means Denmark is still not in the euro, and they put that to a second referendum. That was not a betrayal of the Danish people, because it was a referendum on a very concrete proposal that tried to, that then there was some knowledge about what is, how should this actually be implemented, this vote in '92? Because similar to the Brexit referendum, there was really not a lot of knowledge about what was going to happen if you vote no, just a lot of anger, a lot of reason why people might be incentivized to vote no. So this, of course, has to do a lot with the adversarial nature of British politics, which is why it's so difficult to do this sort of national compromise thing in British politics. Parties are not used to working together. And I will say each party has sort of tried to use the referendum in a way to, sometimes it seems there's a greater interest in ensuring you have intra-party cohesion rather than finding a solution for the nation. And just finally, on a societal point of view, of course, these Brexit identities didn't emerge out of thin air. They were very much reflecting underlying divisions in society that were already there, but perhaps not fully represented in the British sort of two-party-ish system. And they were mobilized very strongly by the Brexit vote. And this sort of cultural divide, or cultural backlash, is very much part of the story while these identities are now so strongly felt. So that cannot be changed. That exists here, that exists on the continent, but I think what could be changed is a very different approach from the political system to how to deal with a result, a sort of moving away from status quo result from the referendum that we saw in 2016. Thank you.
Hello, as you can see, I haven't got any slides. I'm not as organised as these people. I do have some extremely rudimentary visual aids, which I will wave in a moment. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be on this rather stellar panel. What I thought I would contribute this evening is to talk about primarily 2 things, possibly a third, depending on time. The first is an initiative that the Constitution Unit ran between the autumn of 2017 and which published in July 2018, which was, first visual aid, the Independent Commission on Referendums. Then I'll say a little bit about about referendums and Parliament, which flows quite naturally from that, I think. And also both of these flow very nicely from what Robert was saying. And if I get any time at the end, I might say something about this topic, this is another report which we produced last October, quite separate from the Referendums Commission, on the potential for a second referendum on Brexit, which is obviously particularly topical today. We might come to that in questions instead, though. So, to first talk about the Independent Commission on Referendums. Robert said, I think I wrote down his words correctly here, that we haven't thought hard enough about when we use referendums, for what and why, and how they fit with our parliamentary democracy. That is exactly what the Independent Commission on Referendums sought to do. What the Constitution Unit did was draw together a group of 12 very senior figures who represented a plurality of opinions and expertise. The clearest indication of the plurality of opinion was that the members included Dominic Grieve, who has become rather notorious for moving all of these amendments in Parliament from the Conservative backbenches, which are seen as anti-Brexit amendments, and Gisela Stewart, the former Labour MP who chaired the Vote Leave campaign. We also had an SNP member, we had the former chair of the Electoral Commission, we had the political theorist David Runciman from Cambridge, and various others. And what they did was publish this unanimous report looking back on referendum use in the UK. It made a series of detailed recommendations on all sorts of things. As you can see, it's very thick. On all kinds of detailed things about the regulation of referendums, how we should regulate social media, the provision of information, how the government should behave in referendums, and so on. But what I wanted to focus on was these more fundamental questions about the role that referendums should play in our system, when they should be held, when they can enhance our democratic decision-making, and when they might be more problematic for our democratic decision-making. And I think that comparative evidence can be very helpful in addressing these questions. I think it's particularly helpful in at least two respects on these big questions. The first is, if you compare Britain to most other democracies around the world, the thing that marks us apart is that we do not have a written constitution. That's already been referred to. Written constitutions entrench certain decisions and make changing decisions in those areas much more difficult. We don't have any means of, this has already been referred to, making it more difficult to change one law than another law. So if changing our political institutions, it's just like changing any other law. What referendums can usefully do in a system without a written constitution, therefore, is provide a kind of political entrenchment for decisions which are taken by Parliament, which gives them, they're not a higher law, but they have a different kind of political status. And to take good examples of that, for example, the establishment of the Scottish Parliament and the National Assembly for Wales and the arrangements in Northern Ireland following the Good Friday Agreement, very important examples of referendums entrenching decisions, cementing decision-making. But the other thing that we get from international experience is the way that we run referendums in the UK is very ad hoc. Again, partly due to our lack of a written constitution. So we have no rules whatsoever about when referendums should be held, on what kinds of issues and how they should be run. And nothing, anyway, that can't be changed by ordinary law. We don't have any rules about the issues on which they should be held, but some conventions have developed. And one of these is the convention that EU membership should be subject to a referendum, as started in 1975. The other is that we hold referendums on questions of devolution, as we did in the 1970s and again in the 1990s, and have done subsequently. We've held 13 non-local referendums in the UK in total, and those have all been on either devolution, EU membership, or the AV referendum in 2011. So they're all on constitutional issues, and that does mirror arrangements in many other democracies where a referendum is required for constitutional change. What constitutional change means in the UK is a lot less well defined than in most countries, but we seem to be adopting a similar convention. That there are certain aspects of our government framework that require a referendum in order to be approved. But in other countries, constitutional reform, that is a literal amendment to the constitutional document, is not just a one-off affair which is achieved through a referendum. The referendum is part of a process. We are unique in that regard for being able to do differently. So the point is that Parliament is part of the process of decision-making, and a referendum follows a decision by Parliament in order to offer that final entrenchment. So to take some examples, in Australia, a change to the constitution needs to be approved by an absolute majority in both chambers of Parliament, then by a majority of voters across the country, and a majority in a majority of the states. In Denmark, and I say this slightly edgily with Sarah on the platform, I believe Parliament needs to approve a constitutional amendment twice, with a general election between the two approvals, followed by a referendum. And in Japan, you need a 2/3 majority in each chamber of Parliament, followed by a referendum. So nowhere in the world can you simply change your constitution through a one-off referendum, as we can do. Some referendums in the UK have more or less followed the model which is used elsewhere. So, for example, in the AV referendum, Parliament actually legislated for the detail of what AV would mean before the referendum was held. Had it been approved, it simply would have gone onto the statute book and been implemented. Although there were some problems with the campaign, it was perfectly clear if you'd read the legislation what the change would mean. But there are other patterns that we have also followed, which the Commission, despite its diversity of membership, agreed were problematic, and neither of which would be likely to apply elsewhere. The first is what have been dubbed bluff call referendums. That's where the politicians don't want the change, but seek the public's view in order to see off their opponents. In effect, what they want to do is entrench the status quo. I don't know whether Robert would say that Harold Wilson was the first proponent of this kind of referendum or not. David Cameron certainly embraced it with respect to Scottish independence when he hoped to see off the nationalist cause. Following Wilson's success on Europe and his own success in 2014 on Scottish independence, Cameron chose to gamble again in the Brexit referendum, which was the ultimate bluff call referendum. Complaints about bluff call referendums don't just come from those who feel aggrieved by the result. In fact, this term was coined by the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee of the House of Commons, which is chaired by Bernard Jenkin, who is one of the most prominent Brexiteers. These are some words from its 2017 report on lessons learned from the EU referendum. Using a referendum as a bluff call in order to close down unwelcome debate on an issue is a questionable use of referendums. Indeed, it's incumbent on future parliaments and governments to consider the potential consequences of promising referendums, particularly when, as a result, they may be expected to implement an outcome that they opposed. And the Commission very strongly agreed with that. The other problem of some of our referendum practice, which is a really big problem and is closely related to the bluff call referendum, is the problem of putting a question to the voters if the policy implications of one or other of the outcomes is unclear. This clearly can't happen if Parliament has approved the detail of the implementation plan in advance, as we did on AV. In contrast, in the UK on Brexit, this is PACAC, the Parliamentary Committee again, the government was against the suggested proposal. The consequences were, to paraphrase, unclear, and the Prime Minister of the day would not implement the outcome. There was no proper planning for a leave vote, Referendums are the creations of Parliament and the government. Parliament and the government are therefore accountable and must take responsibility for either outcome. Instead, on Brexit, civil servants were forbidden from preparing for a leave vote. Remarkably, given the Referendum Commission's makeup, it agreed unanimously that referendums in future should only be held post-legislatively when the detail is clear, or that if that's impossible, for example, because negotiations are needed with other parties, there should be a clear blueprint for change with a further referendum held if that blueprint cannot be implemented. I've spoken quite a lot. I'll just say some very quick things about Parliament. How referendums sit alongside parliamentary democracy. Dicey was mentioned, and the most famous, the thing that Dicey is most famous for is saying that the core principle of the British Constitution is parliamentary sovereignty. And clearly referendums in some way challenge that. No formal decision has been taken in the UK, but we do seem to have broadly accepted the logic now that referendums trump Parliament. The acquiescence by parliamentarians to the triggering of Article 50 after the Miller case seemed to demonstrate that. But in the absence of a blueprint, Parliament was left to interpret what leave should mean. There was a period early on after the referendum where I thought the chaos and muddle that ensued would actually end up creating a good advertisement for parliamentary decision-making, getting away from simple yes-no questions, being able to deal with nuance, to think through options, to reach compromises. And in some respects, I think the last couple of years have been quite good for Parliament's confidence and independence. Backbenchers have become more bold. We've started talking about the rights and wrongs of government controlling the agenda to the extent that it does. We've seen in some respects a greater ability for parliamentarians to work together across party divides, long encouraged by things like the growth of select committees. We may, of course, also be seeing the collapse of the party system. But in recent months, we've seen increasing numbers of suggestions that Parliament has failed. It's trying to do something bold and new, but as yet, it has not yet managed to get us out of the impasse. Why not? At heart, of course, the answer is the referendum. That for all the parliamentary independence and cross-party alliances, parliamentarians feel bound by a result which many of them, in truth, didn't support. So while many of them are doing their best in a difficult situation, they're very far from acting as trustees and applying their own judgment. That makes it very difficult for representative democracy to function as it should. So again, and I'll end it here, where referendums help to seal a proposal put by parliamentarians, they can help to strengthen the system. But where these elements of the system are divided, the likelihood is, and the risk, that the system will be weakened as a result. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to speak at this event. After listening to the previous speakers, I'm sort of encouraged to maybe get on with my talk quite quickly, because the main meat of what you guys want to discuss is probably in what was discussed before. But I was invited to take you on a journey to Ireland, and so that's what my brief is, and that's what I'm briefly going to try and do. So let's just start with a little bit of context. We have referendums. We have a lot of them. And there's the full population of them on the slide there for you to see. We've had 40 to date, so that makes us the third or fourth or fifth, depending on how you count it, most regular user of the referendum device in Europe. So we have a lot. But as you can see, it's sort of crept up on us. We didn't have them for quite a long period since the start of our current constitution in 1937. And it's really only since about the end of the millennium that we really begin to see how regular they are becoming. And the reason why we have them, Meg's already given the clue, is because we have a fixed constitution. So the only way you can change our constitution of 1937 is by a referendum, although we have relatively easy rules in comparison to some of the horror cases that Meg was outlining. In our case, it doesn't matter how many people turn out, it doesn't matter how few turn out, and it doesn't matter how close the vote is. So you can have a very low turnout and a very tight vote, and whichever way the vote goes, that's the result of the referendum, and it gets implemented. The constitution gets changed. So that's the context. So we've had a lot of referendums, and we've developed an architecture of our own in terms of the administration of those, but that's not what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about what happened recently. And I suppose to set the scene, I just want to sort of show you about our crisis. So you have your crisis right now, but we had our crisis back in 2009, 2010. I moved back from 21 years working in Manchester just in time for the crisis. So 2010 is just one slide that sort of shows you just how bad things were. We fell off the fiscal cliff from being one of the wealthiest countries in Europe to suddenly being one of the most impoverished in a matter of months. And people were out on the streets. So there was a lot of anger, great depth of anger on the streets as a result of that crisis. And so there was a response by government. And the response came in the form of the establishment of, for want of a better term, we haven't really as a community of scholars settled on what we call these entities: Citizens Assemblies, mini-publics, constitutional conventions. So constitutional mini-public is what most of us now refer to these things as, but effectively I'm talking about a Citizens Assembly. And so this is the generic framework of it, just for the uninitiated, so to bring you up to speed. And at its heart are ordinary citizens. And the citizens are selected only on the basis of random selection. So it's not on the basis of how educated you are, or on the basis of whether you have a particular knowledge of the issue being discussed, or whether you're there to represent a certain interest group. Literally, you are selected in a process of random selection. It's a bit like winning the lottery, although not quite as attractive for most people. But somebody knocks on your door from a market research company and says, "You are it. Come to Dublin and talk abortion for the next couple of months." And of course, most people slam the door at that stage. But eventually, they get their random selection. So there's all sorts of issues about the methodology, and I'm happy to talk about that if you want in the Q&A. But what you end up with then is a pretty good descriptive representation, represented among the usually 99 or so who are selected. A mirror of society. There's good gender representation, there's good age, there's good regional representation. And you have this sense from those 99 that they have been selected. So they haven't run for office. They have been selected, sort of picked out of the air, as it were. Experts, interest groups, and all of those, they're all still involved. So in the first of these two activities we've had in Ireland, the Constitutional Convention, a third of its members were members of Parliament. So Gerry Adams was a member. 2 government ministers were members. There was some representation from the Northern Ireland Assembly. So 33 of the 99 were politicians, senior and junior. And then the other 66 were a random selection of ordinary citizens. In the more recent Citizens Assembly, it was just citizens. And then experts are invited to be experts, not to be members. So it's very different from the old style of Constitutional Convention. The job of the expert is to provide the expertise, to provide the briefing documents, deliver their particular piece of expertise, and then leave the room, because it's regular citizens who are in the game here taking the decision. It's deliberation, so it's small group facilitated discussions, trained facilitators whose job it is to make sure that everyone has equal voice. And then in the Irish case, this is what is particularly unusual, is that in both of these instances, the agenda has been set by government and the outcomes have been determined by government. Many of these mini-publics we see arise in other countries are privately sponsored affairs. So here's a picture of what I'm talking about. This is a picture from each of the two activities, the Constitutional Convention in the blue and the Citizens Assembly in the green. And the sharp-eyed, if you can see it, might notice that it's the same venue. They use the same hotel ballroom for both of those activities, for the very simple reason that this hotel had absolutely superb Wi-Fi. And that was important because the Parliament channel carried the live stream of the public's events, and there was a lot of tweeting and a lot of social media and a lot of live streaming generally. So they really needed good internet connection for what they were doing. But these photographs, what they stand out about is that these are both from the private deliberative sessions where the cameras are switched off. So everyone had to leave the room apart from the members and a few of us who were involved in some capacity or other. So you see over in the blue, the 52.48, they were going to deliberate, they had to deliberate for an hour about some particular matter. The cameras off, and a small group of 8 or 9 people around a table with a trained facilitator, debating about the evidence that they'd read and heard about, and coming up with some considered views that were then fed back to the wider process. And then in the green, for the deliberative scholars among you who may know about Bob Gooden's work on deliberation within, this is an example of an attempt to operationalise deliberation within, because there's no talking going on in that photograph. They're all sitting down writing their own views. They were invited to answer a couple of questions and to write their comments down, and those comments were then taken back and fed into the wider process. So that's the sort of activity that I'm talking about when I talk about Citizens Assemblies, and they've had results. They discussed a number of topics. I don't have time to go into the detail of all the topics, and some of the outputs that they have decided have been ignored by governments, so there is cherry picking. I do not want to suggest that the Irish process was perfect. It certainly wasn't, but it's taken us down a road as an interesting experiment that has produced some outcomes. So the marriage equality of 2015, that referendum, was one of those outcomes. The recommendations of the Constitutional Convention that there should be a referendum on marriage equality and on the surrounding legislation relating to that was fed back to Parliament, and Parliament agreed, the government agreed, and they called the referendum, and a huge majority of people voted yes. This is the traditional photograph. Every time there's a referendum in Ireland, you get a big crowd, well, depending on the topic, a huge crowd or not so huge crowd in the main square of Dublin Castle to hear the announcement of the result and to cheer if they particularly liked it. So that's that picture, and then here's the other picture that I wanted to show you. So this is the more recent abortion referendum of May 2018. It's the same huge turnout by the standards of recent referendums in Ireland, and the same huge vote yes. That surprised many observers. Frankly, as somebody who can be a bit pessimistic, I didn't expect this referendum to pass. I really was surprised not only that it passed, but it passed with a 2/3 majority, like that. So big potential outputs, but that's a strong claim for me to make. So let me spend my final few minutes trying to clarify what I'm getting at. And I was quite struck by some of the earlier remarks. Robert's distinction between the Dicey and the Benn approach. I can't remember, one was saying the referendum's at the end of the process, and the other was suggesting the referendum is at the start of the process. So if I could be so bold to suggest there's a third way and this is the Irish way, which is that in the abortion case in particular, this is what stands out. Because it's not just the binary question of whether you should have abortion or not have abortion. This is really important. It's what that abortion regime would be if you do have abortion. In other words, what legislation would follow from a yes vote on abortion. And the government were fully aware of the need, as was the Citizens Assembly, of the need to make sure that those details were clarified before the question was put to the citizens in a referendum. So if you vote yes, in the event that Ireland votes yes for abortion, under what circumstances would we legislate to allow for abortion? What limits, what restrictions would be put on the rights of a woman to have abortion in Ireland? So the draft heads of bill of the legislation were published in advance of the referendum vote. I think that's really important to get that across. And that's what I'm suggesting with that phrase, that there's more to the referendum than the actual vote. I think discussion about preferendums and the like perhaps distract a little from what is the most important bit, which is it's not just the referendum question, it's what follows after that referendum question that is so crucially important. And so this slide is trying to give you a sort of representation of what I'm talking about here, because what was really also important about this process was it informed the political class. So it wasn't just that the Citizens Assembly, and I could talk about the Constitutional Convention's discussion on marriage equality in exactly the same way, but I'm just focusing on the abortion question and the Citizens Assembly. It wasn't just that the Citizens Assembly just said, yeah, we by 2/3 majority, by the way, the same majority as in the national vote, say that there should be a referendum on abortion. But we want the following pieces of decision to go into the legislation. And that meant that when it went back to a parliamentary committee, a special parliamentary committee was established from representation from both houses of Parliament to in a very detailed way look at the recommendations, hear from experts, the same experts or other experts. They spent many months discussing the same thing, but it was with a view to understanding why the Citizens Assembly had come up with the proposals that they come up with. And so that's reflected in the fact that 640 times in the parliamentary committee they name-check the Citizens Assembly. They're not ignoring it. They're engaging with it. That's just a proxy measure of what they really were doing. They were engaging with it. And then when it went to the referendum itself in May 2018, in the news media coverage, a full 642 references in the few weeks of that referendum campaign to the Citizens Assembly. So it was engaging the interest of the politicians, and there are many examples I could cite of senior politicians standing up and saying that they had read the report of the Citizens Assembly and they had been influenced in coming to their own view on which way to vote in what was going to be an extremely difficult. Brexit is certainly difficult here, but believe me, abortion was hugely difficult in Ireland. This was a matter that had been debated over decades without any final resolution. Parliamentary debate after parliamentary debate, successive referendums trying to resolve the issue, all failed until this moment where they finally managed to break through. So, I'm nearly finished, but in essence, and I don't want to suggest this is some grand design, a lot of this is accident and serendipity, but in essence what we have developing here is something along the lines of, if you follow the deliberative literature, you'll know of the Oregon Citizens Initiative Review process, which feeds into the referendums in the state of Oregon. And in a sense, we've got something like this potentially happening in Ireland. If you take the marriage equality, the abortion, and indeed the more recent blasphemy referendums as examples. So you have your standard representative stroke direct democracy kind of framework where there's some sort of pressure, some sort of input into the government and parliamentary process that says we need legislation on some matter, or we need to have a referendum if it's going to change your constitution. And the government brings the matter to the parliament knocks it about for a bit, and then there's an outcome. That's your standard approach. And in essence, what we are beginning to see in Ireland is that the constitution of mini public has been brought into the equation. And that's what happened in both of the abortion and the marriage equality referendums. That Parliament gave the matter to another entity, to a mini public, gave it a number of months, gave it the resource and the time to come up with their own views on the matter. But those views then had to be fed back into the normal representative process. So the deliberative mini public was only advisory. It had no other function but to give a view, which could be ignored, could be rejected. But in both those instances, was followed. And finally, I just want to bring you up to speed on the voters, because one of the interesting facets of this is that it also, we have some evidence, admittedly limited. We don't have the deep pockets that Sarah and her colleagues have to go out and do all sorts of fancy research. So we have to rely on our own more limited resources. But we managed to buy some questions on an exit poll, a large sample exit poll that the Irish broadcaster, RTE, held on the day of voting for the abortion referendum. So we asked one question of a representative sample of Irish voters. How aware were you of the role of the Citizens Assembly in the lead up to this abortion question? And 2/3 were aware. Now, okay, it's quite easy to answer a question that, you know, I'm aware, therefore I tick the box and that's fine. But we also asked some objective knowledge questions. So you say you were aware, well, answer these questions. So to what extent can you answer these questions correctly? And what those slides show you that in all instances, there's very high correct answers from a representative sample of Irish voters. They not only were many aware, but many were able to answer factual questions about the Citizens Assembly. And in a piece of research that we're just finishing to try and get off to a journal, we look at the relationship between awareness, objective knowledge of the Citizens Assembly and the yes vote. And we find a statistically significant relationship. So the yes vote will have been explained by all sorts of things, the youth vote and non-religious vote and certain political party support bases and all of that. But in the mix, objective knowledge of the Citizens Assembly was also a feature in helping to explain the yes vote. So it's a model that has worked in Ireland so far, and it's a model I would heartily recommend for your country if you ever had the time to run your Brexit thing again. But I'll stop there.
So, we've heard from our panel. It's now time to hear from you. We have some people with microphones, so if I do pick you to ask a question, if you could wait till the mic comes to you, because I should say that we are also filming tonight's procedure, and your question will therefore be on the film, unless you have a problem with that. If you do have a problem with that, then come and see us afterwards and we can seamlessly edit you out of the broadcast, but we hope you will allow us to use your question. So what I'm going to do is take, say, 4 questions to begin with, and then give the panel a chance to answer whichever they want to answer, and then we'll come back for at least 1 or maybe 2 more rounds. So, could I have the lady there with the mustard gilet? Not quite jaune, but mustard moutarde. Could I have the guy in the red t-shirt? And just for the ease of the microphone provider, the guy next to him. And then could I have, I'm going to do this block and then I will come to that block. And then could I have the guy in the check t-shirt there? And then we'll go to the next block for the other questions. Madam.
Okay, yeah, thanks to everybody for your discussions, very interesting. My first question is to Sarah Hobolt, and the second question is to the entire panel. So you talk about the effective polarization of people who voted for either leave or remain, but I felt that your talk didn't address so much what many sociologists and geographers have identified as some of the key reasons why people voted to leave, for example, which I think were actually not so related to the EU, but were more related to xenophobia, racism, I think a deindustrialization, some of the working class vote that voted to leave because they felt that they had been disenfranchised and forgotten by the political establishment for decades and decades and decades, and austerity, I think, which played a large part. So can you tell us a little bit more about what your research has revealed about these factors and why they contributed, or to what extent they contributed to the leave vote, which I think should never be underestimated. And second question is to the entire panel. Should referendums not be suspended altogether in the UK until we finally get a codified constitution? As, for example, in Germany, under the German constitution, you cannot have referendums. It's illegal. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, the guy in the red t-shirt. Just wait for the mic. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to the entire panel. I wanted to ask 2 questions. So The first to Robert Saunders, the first speaker. Does a danger not exist if returning to the Dyson model that we end up endlessly lengthening every piece of legislation that would be passed? It's hard enough to get it through Parliament, to get a piece of legislation through Parliament if it doesn't have a broad consensus. But a Dyson model would almost give it two obstacles, like two different bodies to get through. And my second question is generally to the entire panel. In Ireland, do these constant referendums not create more polarized attitudes, as was discussed earlier?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, you sir.
Mine is slightly topical, and it's about another referendum to sort out this Brexit deadlock. I will put my cards on the table. I work for the People's Vote campaign, and I hope I've got some support in here. And it seems like, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here. Would another referendum? A referendum has brought us into this deadlock. This like my good friend here said, this polarization. It's brought us into not knowing exactly what Brexit is. Would another referendum, my line is that a referendum brought us into this mess, a referendum will take us out of it. But what do the esteemed panel think about having another referendum to try and sort out the Brexit impasse in Parliament? And as you may have seen, Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn have just this evening said they are potentially going to be backing a motion on people's vote.
Okay, thank you very much. And then if we can move the microphones there. And I think the word is potentially there. Come back. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Looking at the 2015 Referendum Act and its amendments and the debates that went on throughout 2015, there's barely a single question asked, if at all, about what happens if there's a leave vote. Realistically, what could David Cameron or the government have done to set any of that out before the referendum? A white paper, pre-negotiations? Or should there have been someone pushing for legislation for there being a second vote? I realise it's because he thought he would win. But realistically, what could he have done?
Okay, excellent question. So 4 great questions there. One for Sarah about explaining the leave vote. We don't want to relitigate the whole referendum, but if you can talk a little bit about that. One, to ask whether, in fact, we should suspend the use of referendums while we sort ourselves out effectively. A question about whether using the kind of dicey method would actually end up lengthening the process of legislation. A question about whether we can get ourselves out of the deadlock created by the first referendum by a second referendum, or would that be problematic? And then a very interesting question, you know, a sort of counterfactual question in some ways, but an interesting one nonetheless. You know, what could David Cameron and the government have done prior to the 2016 referendum when they were legislating for a referendum to perhaps make for a better process? So I'm going to go in the order in which people spoke, if that's okay. Sorry, Rob.
I'm quite a fan of reverse order myself.
Yes, well, I understand that.
So just to run through, firstly, the question of should we suspend referendums until we have a codified constitution? I think there's a case for a codified constitution. I just don't think we are anywhere near being able to do that. I mean, if we can't do Brexit, how on earth are we, you know, I just think it's an impossible task. So I think if we want to move in that direction, we have to see it as an incremental process. We have to just start by trying to develop some norms and things like when we use referendums, how we operate this kind of process, and maybe down the line that takes us towards a codified constitution. I just don't think it's an achievable thing at the moment. On the point about the danger of lengthening the legislative process, yes, I think that is a danger, though I think we're only talking about a certain kind of legislation. But then if you look at where we are in Brexit, it is taking us forever anyway. You know, this has not been a fast process, and it's not going to, you know, whatever happens in the next few weeks, this doesn't end on the 29th of March. We have got years and years and years of sorting this out to come. So I'm not sure that that actually does make this process any longer. On the point about whether another referendum would deepen divisions and just sort of turbocharge the problems we had in 2016. I think that is a real danger, absolutely. And I think partly for that reason, if there were to be another vote, it can't be just a rerun of 2016. Because if it is, there's quite a high possibility we just end up exactly where we are again now. And even if we don't, we have a big legitimacy problem. You know, what happens if we have a lower turnout, which means that Remain narrowly wins, which means that fewer people backed Remain in a 2019 referendum than backed Leave in 2016. So it has to be something different, I think. If we're going to do it, it has to be on a concrete proposition. And I think that's enough from me.
Okay.
On the reason why people voted for Brexit, I mean, I've also written on that, but I won't go into a lot of detail. But of course, you're right in saying that, yes, it wasn't just about the EU. Indeed, that is something that is characteristic of all these kind of referendums. I mean, referendum is an opportunity for people to express their views on a lot of different things, and we know that there were economic, cultural, sort of identity reasons around it. Sometimes for some people it's also a sort of protest vote. We know, of course, in terms of the sort of key demographics, that age and education were very, very clear divided. So people who are more educated were more likely to remain, and people vote Remain, and people who are younger. That's not to say, though, that, therefore we can just sort of dismiss it, because, I mean, one thing that's interesting of this referendum, compared, for example, to some of the Irish, is there was, in a sense, there was a choice that was very clearly laid forward. I mean, we didn't know what was going to happen, but it was a very intense campaign that said, you know, if you vote to leave, you're going to leave, and these are going to be all the terrible consequences. Yeah, so people were not like, oh, we thought it was going to be all milk and honey if they had listened and believed the government. But they didn't. So that's clear. And that's the same with Brexit identities. Brexit identities are not just about the EU. It's partly what my last point was about. There was an underlying division in society that has been mobilized, and Brexit has become the focal point for this. And I guess in a sort of political science jargon, what we would say is that some of that division is about sort of socially liberal versus socially conservative attitudes. So I'm doing some work on trying to understand what are the sort of norms that are associated with this. And one of the things that load most is attitudes towards the death penalty. Now, that's not a sort of central EU question, but it is something that, and you can probably guess which way it loads, yeah? But these, I'm sure if I did run a norm survey about, you know, what should we do with jihadi brides, that would also load heavily. And that is a divide in British society that's there, and Brexit has become a focal point. And it's also a divide that hasn't necessarily been fully represented by the existing parties. So I think that's real. And that's just to touch upon the second referendum. I mean, that is my one concern. I mean, of course, you can understand the appeal, because clearly Parliament doesn't look like it can sort this out. And it hasn't, as I was trying to outline, done a very good job at trying to bring people together at all. I think they have exacerbated this divide. But a second referendum, of course, people will come to it with these already established identities. And that will mean they will feel very strongly that the other side is just, if you're a leaver, trying to basically take away their voice. And on the other hand, if you're a Remainer, well, you know, they will feel they're taking away something, you know, bringing upon sort of economic catastrophe and so on. So it's not going to be easy, but then again, it's not like sort of leaving without a deal is necessarily going to bring the country beautifully together when they're queuing up for food outside Sainsbury's. You know, that's also not a sort of beautiful moment of national unity. So I'm not sure. I mean, I'm luckily not. You know, I don't have the solutions, but I can certainly see that there's a problem.
Right. Any beautiful moments?
In respect to the first question about referendums being suspended until we get a codified constitution, I think I'd go back to one thing that I said and then say something new, which is, I mean, I agree with Robert, a codified constitution will be very difficult to achieve. It's really not easy to see what the path is to get there. And until we have one, in a sense, referendums do offer us a mode of entrenchment for things like protection of the Scottish Parliament, which otherwise we would not have, because that could have been repealed very easily by a future government. And I think that, I mean, that seems hard to believe now, but if the political entrenchment of the referendum had not been there, the debate about whether there should be a Scottish Parliament might well have continued beyond 1999, and it might well have remained Conservative policy that there shouldn't be one. You know, those counterfactuals are difficult too. I was hoping Sarah would be after me, because she will probably remember these figures better than me, but one of the interesting things in terms of whether we should have any referendums anymore is that immediately after the 2016 referendum, polls showed that people who voted Remain thought that referendums were a really bad idea. Until the campaign for a second referendum got going. At which point Leave voters started to think that referendums were a really bad idea, and Remain voters started to think they were quite a good idea. So there's also public opinion to bear in mind. If you're going to say that we held a referendum to leave and we're never going to have another one, because there's only one way of reversing it politically, which is to hold another one. In terms of whether the other one would get us out of the mess, I'm just tempted to say that one of the things that frustrates me the last few years is the last few months, I suppose, year or so, since this People's Vote campaign has got going, is that it's not just parliamentarians who clearly feel it taboo to talk about reversing the result. That campaign, which is mostly full of people who would like to reverse the result, has got very fixated on a process question, which is about having a referendum, and has spent practically no time trying to convince the British public that Remain is a preferable option. So I'm not convinced, and again Sarah's more on top of the figures, that if there were a second referendum, the result would be the reverse of the previous one. In our report, which I waived and didn't say anything about, we go into the process of what would actually be required in order to have a second referendum, or a further referendum, as we more diplomatically call it here. And it's worth emphasising that this would not be an easy thing to achieve. Referendums require legislation. There would have to be a bill passed through the House of Commons and, of course, the House of Lords, although that's a bit secondary, to get a referendum onto the statute book. And we know how divided the House of Commons is. It's not just, again, a one-off choice, yes or no, hold a referendum. You then have to have a bill with all of the detail, including what the referendum question is in it. And that would be very difficult to pass. It's not that easy to see at the moment what the referendum question would be, and particularly what kind of referendum question could command a majority in the Commons. And it's not easy to see how another referendum would be less divisive than the last one, unless we could do something Irish. Because that clearly does take the sting, the nastiness out of these divisive issues, but that would require a significant extension to Article 50. You're talking about a year's extension or something to allow a deliberative process, and then we might take the sting out. But without that, I'm less sure. I've talked for too long, but I don't think anybody's addressed the man in the check shirt yet. I think what you said is very much in line with what I said about what the Referendum Commission said. How, in order to put referendums to the people, the responsible thing to do is to actually set out what both of the decisions would imply. It's very striking that before the referendum, we heard no talk about Article 50. We heard no talk about the Irish border. We heard relatively little talk about, well, we heard very, very little talk about the impact on the Union with Scotland, on free movement, on trade, and so on. The kinds of details which we've been obsessing about over the last couple of years. It's striking that we put a blog post up on the Constitution Unit blog just before the referendum, which was entitled What Happens If We Vote for Brexit, which actually addressed some of the practical questions and said Article 50, blah, blah, blah. That was one of the only places you could find that information. It had over 100,000 hits. There was so little information elsewhere.
Okay, David.
I heartily recommend Meg's report. I've read it. It's absolutely superb report, so well worth having a look at. I was having a Twitter engagement with Anand Menon this morning. And he's a positive one, I stress, but the point that came up, which is a point I've heard quite a few times about Citizens Assemblies, is, well, if you really want to get the response you want, you set up a Citizens Assembly. And I just wanted to clarify one little detail about the Irish case, is that the Prime Minister, or Taoiseach, who is responsible for forming both of those Irish processes, Enda Kenny, was not a social liberal. He was not in favour of marriage equality. He was not in favour of abortion. Many people at the time saw this as a can-kicking exercise just to kick it into the long grass and just hope that it goes away as a problem. That's what many cynics said. And in the end, they were proven wrong. So it doesn't have to be the case that if you're going to call for a Citizens Assembly, it's because you want a certain outcome. You may want the opposite outcome. I just wanted to address the Irish-related question, though, from the gentleman at the back, who asked if the constant referendums in Ireland create polarised attitudes. It really depends on the subject. So in 1983, when we had the first abortion referendum to put the anti-abortion clause into our constitution, that was highly polarised. My parents talk about the sort of, my mother in particular, about the sort of activity she had to address when she was knocking on doors to try and stop that referendum from going through. It was extremely polarising for society. And the most recent one, to get it back out in 2018, was also very polarising. But I suppose what helped in the latter one was the decision, and it was such a huge majority that it pretty much ended after the referendum in large part. So I suppose it depends on the context and the lead up to the referendum itself. But in truth, more than anything else, the big problem with the constant referendums in Ireland is turn-off. People are getting bored. They're asked too often. And that's a big problem with referendums. If they're used too often, they can really turn people off.
Okay, we'll take one more round of questions. We've got lots of people here. So the man with the Sainsbury's bag, don't know whether we're going to use that to queue up for food in a little while. Lady there. Guy back with a beard, and the guy on the end with kind of a beard. Okay, so I hope you can remember that. Sir.
Yes,
Hi there. How useful can citizens' assemblies be in the UK when all expert information that doesn't support what people already believe in is automatically dismissed as Project Fear? So essentially, how has the quality of public discourse on divisive issues in the UK been so different from that of Ireland? Thanks.
Excellent question. You said with the same background.
Yes. A question I was asked was who my MP was. And the person who asked that question then went on to say, it doesn't really matter because we have manifestos and we vote on the manifestos. Now, to what extent did the failure to implement the Conservative manifesto of 2010 and 2015 in regards to immigration, to what extent? Well, one, to what extent do we have pseudo-referendums? If we're not voting for the individual MP, though legally we are, but we're voting on manifestos, to what extent do we have a pseudo-referendum system? And to what extent did the failure to implement the 100k net immigration in the 2010 and 2015 Conservative manifestos, did that lead to a punishment in the EU referendum?
Okay, great question. And just here, so Lindsay. Yeah.
Thanks. My question is about countries that have referendums where the government holding the referendum doesn't back the change proposal. So obviously the case with Brexit, the government holds a referendum where the change that would be implemented isn't something it's in favour of. Are there countries that do that and do that particularly well? And sort of what are the elements that you think lead to those outcomes? And if governments are going to have referendums where they don't back the change, should they make publicly available the plans for implementing that change?
Great question again. And last question there.
Hi there. To an extent, my question may actually be answered by the answer to that lady's question. But given that we can describe Britain's way of holding referendums most charitably as slapdash, how much of the current shambles that we are in is due to the way that this country organises and holds things like referendums in comparison with countries like Ireland, which have a much more organised process, and how much of it is due to the sheer sort of complexity of the issue itself? So I mentioned that it's an issue which exacerbates a quite core fundamental divide in society. It combines issues of identity, trade, the entire economic model this country operates by, immigration, everything. How much is it down to the fact that we have a sort of back of a fag packet way of organising these things, and how much of it is down to the fact that this is possibly just too big an issue to be resolved by a public vote?
Okay, 4 great questions, which I'm not going to summarise. I'm going to go straight to the panel, and just for Rob's sake, I will go in reverse order. So, David, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm only going to answer one of the questions because I'm not really qualified to comment on the others, I think. But it's the first question about how useful can a Citizens Assembly be in the case where there might be a question about the objectivity of the experts. I think that was the question from that gentleman over there, something along those lines. And that's a really important question. I'm glad you've raised it, because a common criticism of deliberative mini-publics, a common criticism is that they can be hijacked by the choice of experts and the risk that the experts steer the citizens in a certain way and a way that is not appropriate because they should be objective. And it's a really hard nut to crack, to be frank. But you can do what you can to try and minimise the risk. So in the case of the more recent Citizens Assembly in Ireland, as opposed to the previous one, they ran that, I think, a lot better, which was, for example, when they were dealing with the abortion topic, that was over 5 months of deliberation and meetings. They had an expert advisory group that was made up of ethicists, lawyers and medics. And it had to work together with a steering group that consisted of a sample of the members from the Citizens Assembly. And between them and the judge who was chairing the whole process, the Supreme Court judge, they had to agree on which experts to invite and the balance of experts. So, for example, when they had a discussion about when life begins, they had to have that was quite an important topic quite early on in the process. At what point does life begin? They had 2 ethicists, one who was very much from the pro-life perspective and openly so, and one from the pro-choice perspective. And they then had a fascinating ping-pong between the 2 of them in front of the Citizen Assembly members. So through processes like that, you can try to minimise the risk, I suppose is what I'm saying.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Let me also say something in relation to that question, but from a different angle, because there's a Constitution Unit project I haven't been able to plug yet, which is the fact that back in, goodness, when was it now? 2017, autumn 2017, we held a Citizens Assembly on Brexit, which was funded by the UK and Changing Europe initiative. It had 50 members who met over 2 weekends. It was slightly small scale compared to some of the exercises that have been done. And it was clearly not an official body. But it did follow a lot of the procedures that David has described, both in terms of the random selection of members, where we were extremely careful to get a mix of various kinds, including geographical spread, but crucially the correct balance on the Brexit vote, the 52-48. And also we followed some of these procedures in terms of having a steering committee that included people from both sides of the divide and so on, and carefully choosing our experts. And in response to one part of the question, I think, is about the relationship between the experts and the members of the Citizens Assembly. And there we had no pushback whatsoever from the members of the Citizens Assembly. They really appreciated the presence of the experts. They absolutely soaked up all of the information. They asked them lots of questions. The feedback at the end was incredibly positive on the experts. And they appreciated the fact that they learnt a lot. The thing that I think concerns me more is about whether in a big divided country like ours at the moment, compared to Ireland, where this stuff is more entrenched, whether the conclusions of the Citizens Assembly would be accepted by the broader populace, or whether the broader populace would believe that they had been captured by the experts on whichever side. I don't think it would happen to the citizens, but I think the presentation of it could be quite difficult.
Okay, sorry.
On the question on immigration and whether or not some of this is due to the failure of governments, in a sense, to implement their manifesto policy, promises, or generally their policy on immigration, there is quite a lot of evidence that actually going back before Conservative, but going back to Labour's decision, the Labour government's decision on enlargement of, in a sense, this was not something Labour had to do, but open the border immediately after the eastward enlargement. And that led to a lot more immigrants coming in than the Labour government had estimated. That led to a linkage in people's minds between opposition to immigration and opposition to the EU that hadn't been that strong before, and that carried on. And clearly that linkage was very much exploited very successfully by the Leave campaign, in a sense saying, this is the way you've had governments that were not able to control immigration, although these governments, of course, would have had the power to control immigration from outside the EU, but this was all linked very effective. And I think so that decision, first by Labour and then subsequently also by Conservative governments, saying we're going to have immigration targets that they clearly were not going to meet. I think because, again, as I said before, the EU was not particularly salient, but at the time the referendum was held, immigration was very salient, and interestingly have become a lot less salient since 2016. So I think that's a very valid point. And then just, sorry, David, I on the whole, how do other governments hold referendums so beautifully? Because you've talked so wonderfully about Ireland, I will have to say this, because I once wrote a book about referendums also in Ireland. And I mean, this is not sort of just a British phenomenon, this thing. I mean, when you had a referendum on the Nice Treaty, this was also all sorts of different, they're very low turnout, as you said, and issues so this was the Nice Treaty that really didn't have a lot. This was the sort of preparing for enlargement treaty. And the campaign was, there's going to be a European army and we have to end neutrality. The EU is going to force us to change our rules on abortion. And I mean, this was, a similar kind of mess. But then, of course, they had a second referendum. But just to say, let's not go away and think, the Irish governments, they just have always known how to do this. It's just the British. I mean, referendum do inspire that kind of people vote on all sorts of reasons. And that is why the embedding of direct democracy within the representative process is so important, because referendum itself is a way that people have their voices heard on all sorts of issues. And it's really up to, I think, the representative institutions to ensure that they're properly embedded.
I don't want to take up too much time, but does anyone, before I go to Rob, have an answer to the question about governments who campaign for or against a change, but the change happens, and what governments then do? So in other words, what happens to governments that lose?
But that's partly the Irish and the Danish example. I mean, in both cases, I mean, I think the Danish was a bit, they then came together with the parliament and came up with a negotiation position that was supported by parties on both sides. Yeah. And they then went to the EU on that platform and said, this is what we think we can get through to the public. Yeah. And they got these opt-outs from the EU because, of course, the challenge, going back to the question on what Cameron could have done, is here. It's not just up. I mean, sometimes we forget in the Brexit debate, well, it's not just up to Britain what they want. I mean, there is another negotiation partner, which is obviously the EU. But then clearly they had a mandate. After they then got that deal, that protocol through, they came back. And Ireland did something similar, although it wasn't as legally binding. I mean, they got a sort of political declaration back on, actually, you're still going to be able to remain neutral and so on. And so they got to allay some of those fears. So that was a sort of slightly similar.
So interestingly, governments who lose, as it were, then try afterwards to achieve consensus and move forward on that basis, which possibly didn't happen here. Rob?
I think a theme of a number of the questions is a useful reminder that, for all the things we've said this evening, the problems in British politics since 2016 don't begin in 2016. That the referendum hypercharges them and it fires them through a particularly destructive political mechanism. But the point the gentleman made about irresponsible promises on immigration that the government seemingly had no intention of keeping, the collapse of faith in politicians but also actually in experts, and the failure of many of us actually to think about how we communicate with the electorate and how we talk to and listen to the electorate. The problems of a media culture that has played quite a significant role in shaping British attitudes towards Europe. So while we do need to fix the mechanism, in some respects, what the mechanism has done is to lift the rock and show us what was happening underneath. And my worry about, I think there's a lot of mileage in thinking about how we use institutions like Citizens Assemblies, but exactly there's going to be a problem with how the media then reports their results if they don't like them. There's going to be a problem with what happens when political parties, financial interests, perhaps slightly murky sources of funding, try to get to work on this process and to pull it in directions that they like. So I think the purpose of tonight really was to think about how we do referendums better, but that's only one part of
thinking about how we rebuild our political debate.
Okay, that seems to me a great place to finish. Before I finish, I want to remind everybody that there are drinks downstairs. There's also an opportunity to buy Rob's excellent book. If you're a Brexiteer, Dan Hannon wrote about it. Captivating read, meticulously researched and exquisitely written. If you prefer a more, some would say, objective view, Andrew Marr said, gripping, a jaw-dislocating page-turner. If you care about contemporary politics, you really need to read it, and I would, having read it, endorse that. One thing I would say, somebody mentioned, I think one of the people on the panel mentioned, that one of the reasons that the abortion referendum in Ireland has not caused this polarisation is the sheer strength of support for the change that came about a year ago. We do have to remember, of course, that the result of the 1975 referendum was seen by many commentators as settling this issue once and for all. And I think one of the lessons from 1975 is, well, perhaps in time that isn't necessarily the case. So could you say thank you to our panel? We'll see you guys soon.